it on him, he just wrung his neck. What do you call that? Tenderizing the meat? All right. Okay, we are still looking into Joseph and his story. So we left off. We're going to pick up on chapter 40 if you're following along. Genesis chapter 40. All right, so we left off last week. Joseph had become the chief steward in Potiphar's house. He had managed all of his affairs. Potiphar's wife had basically taken that way too literally and attempted to have an affair with him. He ran, left his coat. She used that as evidence against him, and that got him thrown in prison. And so that's where we left it. Joseph had gone to jail. So we also saw that over time in jail, he had become basically the deputy warden. The warden didn't worry about anything. He left it all in Joseph's hands. Okay, so Joseph had become the head trustee, if we were to use today's vernacular, today's language, but it was more than that. Okay, so a trustee doesn't get as much responsibility as Joseph had in that day. So we pick up the story. Joseph has been there now for some time. And that's what it says, exactly what it says in verse 1. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master, the Pharaoh. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. Now they remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. While they were in the prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed they both looked upset. Why do you look so worried today? So they've been there long enough for Joseph to get to know them, to get to know their moods, get to know how they were normally and what their faces look like. So they have a couple of dreams, and so now Joseph has noticed that they seem down, they seem depressed. So now remember that Joseph was only 17 when he arrived in Egypt. Now, we don't know how long he served before he was thrown into prison. But he was, this is a spoiler alert, and we'll find out here in the next few verses, that he was 30 when he became Pharaoh's right-hand man. So 17 to 30 is 13 years. Those 13 years he was either in Potiphar's house or he was in prison. Okay? Now, it's quite tempting to go, well, okay, so that's 6.5 and 6.5. And that may have been the way it worked, right? But we don't know. So it could have been, 4 and 7. It could have been, or 4 and 9. It could have been anything. Okay, we don't know what the division was. So, but Joseph has now been in prison for some time. Okay, we don't know how long he served in Potiphar's house. We don't know how long he's been in prison. But he's been there long enough to become the managing or administration, the force of the business. Okay, he's running the business. At this point, all we know for sure is that Joseph is somewhere in his mid-20s. 24, 25, 26, something like that. That's what we know at this point, okay? Joseph keeps the books. There's nothing that gets done in that prison that Joseph isn't responsible for. So he's keeping the books. He keeps the count. He makes sure everybody's accounted for. He manages the meals, etc., etc., okay? Anybody ever see Shawshank Redemption? Right? So while that's not a real clean comparison, it gives you an idea, right? The convict was managing the warden's money, okay? So Joseph was managing the warden's business, and his business was making sure that this prison ran efficiently. Now, that being said, don't think of how we do prisons today as to the way they did prisons back then. It's a whole different animal, okay? So prisons back then, at least according to archaeologists and those who have studied such things, not many convicts were kept in the prison. Mostly the people who were in the prison were those who were waiting on trial or sentencing, okay? So you didn't have, typically, you didn't have long-term incarceration in the prison. No inmates, okay? And mostly that is because punishments back in the day were immediate. Now, you didn't wait, 10 years to go to trial. And you also didn't get, okay, we didn't like what you did. You broke the law. You're going to serve 15 years in prison. No. The punishment was much, much quicker than that. And it was something like you were sentenced to death. Okay? And as soon as the judge, the magistrate, and Pharaoh, the Egypt during this time period did have a justice system, Pharaoh sat at the top of it. So Pharaoh was the supreme court, if you will. Okay? But they did have magistrates that worked at the lower levels. And so you might be sentenced to death. Well, if you were sentenced to death, there was no appeal. Right? They marched you out the back of the courthouse and shot you or hung you or whatever it was they were going to do. Okay? It might have been physical disfigurement. For someone who told a really egregious lie, they might get their nose cut off. Right? And if you've ever, well, nobody in here, obviously, but if you've ever had your nose cut off, it's very difficult to work in the rain. Ha, 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 ha. Really? Nobody?
I'm still on. They might shoot you with their Egyptian bullets.
So, it was obvious, right, that you might get your left hand cut off, your right hand cut off. They might remove a toe or a leg. I mean, just something along those lines. Or, and most probable, was you were sentenced to hard labor, slavery. Okay? Now, everybody thinks that the pyramids were built by the Jewish people. And to be sure, that did happen. They did have a large part to play in that. However, there are no Jewish people in Egypt at this time. And there were still pyramids going up. And so it was convict labor. Right? So they would sentence you out and you would go out to the quarries where you would begin to do the back-breaking work of cutting out the stones, the granite, that they were making pyramids out of. All right? So, and you might have a term, you might not. It might have been life, and life might have only been 2 years, right? Because the work was that hard. So there was no just sitting around a jail waiting on Oprah to come on. You were sent out and you were put to work. That was the jail time. Okay, so like I said, most of them sentenced to slavery were sent to the quarries, and basically what this does is it reveals to us that Joseph, being kept in the prison, becoming a manager of the prison, this was God's handiwork. God still had his hands on Joseph, okay? Because this was not normal. Joseph became a resident in the prison. And so, again, they didn't normally do this. So we see the hand of God at work, still at work in Joseph's situation. All right? So we also are introduced in this section of scriptures now. We got two VIPs, right? Two white-collar criminals. All right? We don't know what they did. But Joseph is given charge of these while they wait on Pharaoh's pleasure to decide what to do with them. They're kept in this prison, and it's Joseph's job to make sure that they get fed and that they're taken care of. Okay? But they're not your run-of-the-mill thieves or murderers. Okay? They came from the king's house. They were part of the government, if you will. Okay? And we look closely at the scriptures, and chief baker, chief butler, that's cupbearer. That's what that meant. It was a butler. Okay? So being chief, they were heads of department. Right? So all of the under butlers and under bakers, they answered to these two guys. So they ran the crew, if you will. Okay? Now the chief butler is of some interest here. If we can understand, so Nehemiah is a Jewish guy, taken in the raid that Nebuchadnezzar made, the raids that Nebuchadnezzar made on Judah, and he became a cupbearer or head butler to the king at that time. Now this would be several hundred years later, okay? But it was Nehemiah who had influence with the king that convinced the king to let the Jews return to Jerusalem and begin building the wall. Nehemiah and Ezra were contemporaries, okay? And they rebuilt Jerusalem during this time. And the king, because of Nehemiah's influence, okay, so the cupbearer served in the presence of the king at all times. If you were an advisor, the king would call for you, hear what you had to say, and then dismiss you. But the butler was always present, right? Because if the king got thirsty, the butler was standing right there, you know? And so the king and the butler would become not friends, but very familiar with each other, all right? And so you can find that story in Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2. And again, using that as our reference, we see that this cupbearer could have had quite some influence on the king. All right. As much as I looked and looked and looked, and there is just absolutely no discussion on what crimes these two may have committed. It's just not mentioned. We don't know. Okay? So it's left up to us to speculate as to what exactly it was that they were guilty of. I mean, how much trouble can a butler and a baker get into? Apparently, quite some trouble. Okay? So let's pick up here and walk through some of the rest of the story. So they replied. Now remember, Joseph just asked them. He said, "What? You look down. Have you ever come into work and looked at one of your colleagues and say, 'Hey, man, what's going on?' You know, so you look a little off this morning. You know, you look sad. You look down. You know, the dog died, or you know, the wife and I aren't getting along, or the husband and I aren't getting along." But you can see that something is going on, and so that's what's happened here. Joseph asked him. He said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well," they replied, "we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." And Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. Now, this is a window that we have still into Joseph's faith, right? He still puts a lot of trust in God. God tells dreams. You tell me what maybe I can help you out there, okay? So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. He said, in my dream, I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes, squeezed the juice into the cup, and then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. All right? Even in the ancient world of this day, they recognized that dreams could be messages from the gods. Okay? And so dreams were very important. And they would go to magi or a wise man or a religious priest and get an interpretation of the dream. Right? But being in prison, no one cared. Nobody cared. Nobody's going to come visit a prisoner. Okay? There's not a prison chaplain who's going to sit down with these guys and go, oh, here, I'll tell you what these dreams meant, except for Joseph, right? And it just happens that Joseph has some experience with this. It's not his role or his job to do this kind of thing, all right? So we saw in the first dream 3 branches, and there are 3 actions that the grapes undergo, right? They bud, they blossom, and they bear fruit. All right? Bud, blossom, and bear fruit. So we see 3s. These 3s, of course, we immediately recognize as being symbolic of the Trinity, being symbolic of God. But back in that day, that was not something that was widely known, okay? Especially for folks that were outside of the Jewish or the religious system that the Jews had in place, okay? Now, Joseph, who had dreamed dreams of God himself, is now given the gifts of understanding the dreams. Now, it's quite possible that he's always had this. It's quite possible that Joseph, when he dreamed his own dreams, you remember the dreams that he had, right? We were gathering wheat and standing them in sheaves, right? You put them in little stacks that stood up like this, and y'all's bowed down to mine. He told his brothers, y'all's bowed down to mine. That's quite possible that Joseph understood exactly what that meant, that one day he would be king and everybody would bow down to him, right? And he may have even said that. Seems kind of obvious, right, to us today, but back then, not so much. And so Joseph may have understood what these dreams meant. God may have had given him this gift already, which is why Joseph would have said, hey, God gives me interpretations of dreams. Just tell me your dreams and I'll tell you what they mean. So he understood that. So we see that Joseph has this gift of understanding the dream. And of course, this dream is in line with the station that the butler had in life. The butler served the drinks. And so it's quite natural that he would dream of all that went into the butler. The butler would have chosen the grapes. He would have sampled the wine before it got to Pharaoh. Okay, this is all a part of his responsibility. And so we see them. So Joseph then says, so this is what the dream means. We're picking the story up in verse 12. This is what the dream means. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Okay? Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up, restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer, and please remember me and do me a favor. When things go well for you, mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. I'm innocent. Innocent, I say. Innocent, right? Now, Joseph is telling the truth. But how many times have we heard someone who they got him dead to rights, got him on video, got photographic evidence, you know they did it, and what do they say? I'm innocent, I'm being frank, right? It's the common thing. So it's become so cliched that what do? We just turn off. Yeah, right, okay, that's great, okay? Yeah, you're innocent. I got it, you're innocent. So it's obvious to us now, as soon as Joseph begins to explain the dream, 3 branches in 3 days, okay? Again, the Trinity, the threes, this is godly. And so we see the 3 branches in the 3 days. If this seems familiar to you, I do. Jonah was in the whale's belly for 3 days. Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days. It's a universal theme to be delivered in 3 days. Okay? And so we see the 3 days as the time frame here. And like I said, for us today, we look at that and we go, well, yeah, duh. But remember that back then, it's the same kind of thing, right, with Solomon and the story of the baby, the 2 women and the baby. We go, well, yeah, duh, split the baby, the mother's not going to. But that was a radical thought for that time. Okay? So we see that Joseph interprets this deal. But we also see something else going on with Joseph. It's the first time we've seen it, right? Now, we'll see Scripture here in a little bit. We'll know that when his brothers threw him in the pit, he begged them to let him out. He cried out to them, right? We're going to see that guilt hit the brothers in a little bit. But since he's been in Egypt, we haven't seen too much about Joseph, except for now, right? And now he says, we see his faith falter a little bit, because what did he say? He said, remember me, right? So he's realized, as he's interpreting this dream, that you're fixing to get out of here. Pharaoh's going to pardon you. Not only is he going to pardon you, he's going to welcome you back to your position with open arms. And Joseph understands exactly what we discussed just a few moments ago with Nehemiah, that the cupbearer has Pharaoh's ear. Right? He can speak to Pharaoh when no one else can. And so he says, remember me, right? Mention me to Pharaoh. I've been kidnapped. I didn't do anything. I landed in prison, but I didn't do anything wrong. Tell Pharaoh my story. Okay? And so we see that for the first time, right? We see Joseph's faith, maybe he's faltering a little bit. I'm forgotten. God I've followed God and I've ended up in this prison, but I don't belong here. All right? And so he's been in Egypt now, and we know this. We know this because in the next few verses it's going to tell us. We know this. He's actually been in Egypt now for 11 years. Now, we don't know how long he was in Potiphar's house. So in this 11 years, he was 17. So fast forward 11 years, that makes him 28. Okay? And remember, when we first started our conversation, we thought, he's mid-20s somewhere when he went to prison. But when this dream sequence occurs, he's 28 years old. And he's been in prison, or he's been a slave for most of his adult life. If not all. He's 17, right? Can you imagine 17? And then you've either served a man as a steward in the household, or you've been in prison. And that's all you've known since you were kidnapped, since you were taken from your father's house, okay? And so we see that in that 11 years, we don't see anything from him until now. And now he says, hey, remember me. He asks Pharaoh or he asks for a favor, and that Pharaoh be told, right? Hey, he's a just man. He'll hear my story, right? Maybe now, perhaps it's the first time he's ever thought that maybe God has forgotten him, right? Maybe God had a plan. He's trusted all of his life that God has a plan. But he's in a place now where he can no longer see what God might be doing. I mean, when he was at Potiphar's house, he was like, okay, at least I've got some responsibility. With that comes some freedom. I can move around the city, right? He had a job to do. Now he's in a prison, okay? And he's dealing with convicts, people who have been suspected of a crime, and most are guilty. So he can't see God's plan. He doesn't understand God's plan. He may even be in the place where, is there a plan? Right? Have I been forgotten? How many of us, don't raise your hand, because if I ask you to raise your hand, everybody would have to raise your hand. How many of us have ever been in a place in our life where we think, God has forgotten me? Right? He had a plan. He was moving me around the board, and I was happy to go, and now I've gotten here, and he's forgotten me. I'm stuck. Right? God's attention has been... Why do we think that? Why do we think that? Honestly.
Well, we're human.
Because we're human. Because what? We do that. How many times have we been doing something and squirrel, right? And we get drug off over here, and then pretty soon we're like, now wait a minute. I was doing something. I was doing something important. What was I doing?
Making a sandwich and it's still sitting there on the counter.
Yeah, 2 pieces of bread are still sitting on the counter. Where did the meat go, right? Right? We do that. We do that. And so because we are prone to do that.
He was making a wish sandwich.
I was making what?
A wish sandwich.
Oh, so I was wishing there was a sandwich?
I wish I had some meat to put between his bread.
So we do that. We forget where we are. We forget where we're doing. How many of us have pets? Right? We let the pet out into the dog or out into the backyard, and 2.5 hours later, the spouse comes through and says, hey, where's the dog? Oh, I forgot. I left the dog in the backyard. What do you think the dog is going through? Right? I mean, if you know anything about dogs, you can be gone for 5 minutes, and they're like, oh my God, you've been gone for so long. Right? They're back in the backyard going, you forgot me, you forgot me. And of course, 30 seconds later, Did you forget the dog in the backyard? 30 seconds later, right? What are you doing? What's the dog doing? You're forgiven. All is well. Just, scratch me behind the ears. Right? But that's where Joseph is right now. And it's important because we feel that way. Has God forgotten me? I mean, he put me here. Things were going great, or as good as could be expected. And then suddenly I'm here and nothing's happening. I'm stuck, right? And so what does Joseph do? While, as we will see, he maintains his faith, right? He remains steadfast in his trust in God. He's dealing with human doubt. And he does the same thing that his great-grandmother did. I had to think about it. I'm counting back. Right? Sarah. I know God told you, Abraham. God told you that there was this plan, but apparently it's been 15 years. And, I'm not pregnant yet, so I'm going to have to help God out. So here's Hagar. Here's my slave girl. Here's how we're going to have kids. This must have been what God meant. Right? And so Joseph is like, maybe I need to help God out. Maybe this is the chance God's given me. I just need to remind this guy to listen to God. Right? And aren't we like that? Don't we like to help God? Right?
I wouldn't call it helping because anything we do is going to mess it up work.
Well, that's true. Well, so I understand the sentiment, right? Anything that we do, yeah, it's going to mess things up worse. Nothing that we can do will mess up God's plan, right? It may not help it, but we can't mess it up. So I want to bring this out. I want you to see that Joseph, he is a hero. He's a hero of the faith. And I don't want to let that go. But he's also just like one of us, right? He has his weak moments. This is one of them. Hey, remember me. Tell Pharaoh about me. I'm a kidnapped kid. My face is on a milk carton. Okay? And so we all feel that way. We all get into that place. Okay? All right, so continuing now our scriptures. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation, he said to Joseph, I had a dream too, right? In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastry stacked on my head. Right? He's all excited because the butler, he got a good thing. So I had dreams with 3s. So I have three baskets of white pastry stacked on my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head. This is what the dream means, Joseph said. 3 baskets also represent 3 days. Okay. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up. Now remember, this is exactly what he told the butler. Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will come and peck away your flesh. Yikes! Okay, that's a real downer there. That poor baker, he got all excited that whoa, I'm gonna. And if Joseph had interpreted the baker's dream first, the butler probably would have been like, never mind, have no dreams, right? But the baker's got a problem here, okay? So we see here the baker is hopeful. The baker is hopeful. The butler's being restored. My dream is similar. It does have the 3 days in it, but this time to everlasting shame. Okay? He is going to be made an example. They're going to put his corpse on display, right, and let the birds eat it. Even though this is a pagan culture, right, they still honored the dead body, right? They still buried it. And so to be left exposed like that after death, and the body desecrated by the birds, the animals of the field, right? This was the greatest humiliation that could be done. Okay, so we see that the butler's restored, but the baker's not going to be. The baker's going to be executed. So for whatever, we don't know what their crimes were, but apparently the butler could be forgiven, right? So we think, well, maybe maybe he spilled wine on Pharaoh's favorite coat, right? He tripped going up there, whoops. And of course, you know how wine is. Wine will stain. This is my favorite coat, and now it's got this big ugly stain in it, and to prison with you, right? But the baker. Got to get these guys right. The baker could not be forgiven.
Just remember, there's no candlestick maker.
Yeah, there's no candlestick maker. That's true.
Yeah.
The baker could not be forgiven. So perhaps he had embezzled. He'd stolen some of the food money, used it for himself. We don't know. We don't know what it is, right? But whatever it was, Pharaoh could not forgive the baker. I missed a slide here. Okay, so y'all squint because this one's going to be tiny. Sorry about that. So Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, he prepared a banquet for all of his officials and his staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and his chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted the dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never gave him another thought. Okay? So it happens just the way Joseph explains. Let me get over here. Happens just the way Joseph explains, right? They actually, it's worse than Joseph had seen, because he calls a big feast and he calls these guys up, and in front of all of their colleagues, all of the other officials and the staff in the house, the butler is forgiven and welcomed back to his position, right, in front of all of his friends and family. But the baker is executed in front of all his friends and families. So we see that coming out. But what about Joseph's plea? Right? To be remembered. So the butler, now, all right, so I want you to think about it. The butler has been restored. He was in prison. The baker's been killed. And so do you think the butler's going to immediately go to Pharaoh and say, hey, dude, thanks for the pardon. I'm really glad to be back. Oh, yeah, by the way, whilst I was in prison, okay, so he is not going to risk his position by bringing up Joseph's story, right? He's going to just go, okay, everything is good. I'm going to keep my head down. I'm going to stay out of the limelight. I am just going to chill for a while, okay? So the butler would not risk his position. It would mean reminding Pharaoh of his own misdeeds, and in his mind thereby risk making Pharaoh mad at him again, right? It's just too close, right? It's too quick. I just got out of this and I'm going to go, hey, while you had me in prison for that thing that you just pardoned me for, and Pharaoh will be like, yeah, since I'm thinking about that again. I worked with a guy one time. He and his cousin were playing in Daddy's barn, and they burned the barn down. Much like my own son and a friend of his burned my pole barn down one time, all the way to the ground. But anyway, he was telling me the story. He said, yeah, we burned the barn down. And he said, for a year after he burned the barn down, every time his daddy thought about it, he grabbed him and gave him a whipping. Right? That's human nature, right? It's like, you burnt my barn down, boy. Okay? And so this is what the butler's a little worried about, right? Pharaoh's going to get to thinking about it again. Man, I really like that coat, right? And so he's not going to bring it up at all, okay? And like we talked about it before, it's a little reminiscent of Sarah's plan to help God giving Abraham children. So thing to remember, and we kind of alluded to this, right? God's plans will happen on God's timetable, right? When God determines that things are supposed to happen, they will happen. Until then, there's nothing you can do to hurry them along, but there's also nothing you can do to delay them. God's plans will happen when God says they will happen. We can't help them, and we can't hurt them. So, worked one time with a guy, he was Muslim, Islamic. And he was telling me all about the 12th Imam. So in the Muslim religion, Islam, they have their own prophecies, and they believe that the 12th Imam will come back to earth from God, and he will restore peace to the earth. If that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because Muhammad was a product of a Catholic priest and the children of Abraham. So that he had all this stuff in there. Anyway, But they also have a teaching that they have infused in all of that, is that if they make life and make the earth miserable enough, in other words, if they promote chaos and war and all that, they will force that 12th Imam to come early. That's why they're not afraid. They let's just have it out. Let's start wars. Let's just go get them, right? Because they think if it gets bad enough, he'll come early. Well, the problem with that is God is not forced to do anything by what we do, right? God's plans are according to God's timetables. And if you think you can do something to hurry along, God has already foreseen that and planned for that. Right? So you're not helping. You're not hurting, but you're not helping. It's a little bit like this. How many of y'all, when you were kids, obviously, how many of y'all played on the playground where, the two most popular people were called team captains and they got to pick teams? Y'all ever had to pick teams, right? All right. So how many of y'all, don't raise your hands because I'll raise my hand. How many of y'all were always the last one or nearly the last one picked? Right? And what was the deal here? So the team captains, they would obviously immediately pick their best friends to be on their team. And then they would consult. And what they would consult about is what you could bring to the team. Oh no, don't get Charlotte. She's no good at it. We want to get Carl. Carl's really good. Carl can help the team. And so you would pick. So think about this. When God picks, there's nothing you can bring to the team. Let's think about that. Nothing you can bring to. God doesn't look around and go, yeah, I'm taking Frank because if when I convert Frank to Christianity, to believing in my son, Frank is going to be the guy that sells this to Mesopotamia. Right? No. God's not picking you because you're valuable to the team, because of what you can bring, right? God's picking you because you're his best friend, right? That's why you get picked. I want you near me. You're my buddy. You're my friend. I want you to be on my team because I want you to be around. But you're not helping, right? There's nothing you bring to the team. I've already done it. And so we got to remember that. God's plans happen on God's timetable, right? We can pray about it. We can pray for God to be quick. Please be quick, Lord. Please be quick. But it's going to happen as God sees fit. Okay? All right, so that's where Joseph is. So all this just folds back to Joseph telling the butler, remember me. Right? Remember me. He's 28 years old at this point. He's been away from home for a long time. And so, 11 years. And so, we know that because in the next verse, it says, 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed a dream. Okay? 2 full years. So, after the butler left, 2 more years go by. And that's when Joseph's going to end up in front of Pharaoh. So we know he's 28 years old because it gives us his age when he ends up in front of Pharaoh. Okay? And so 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. A miracle in and of itself. If you've ever been on the Nile, you know all the crocodiles are down. Here come these cows prancing up out of the river. He saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. And then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. I should say so. I mean, 7 skinny cows eating 7 fat cows and then not gaining any weight. I mean, they didn't even have a fat belly from eating all that. But he fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. And this time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. And then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. Then these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. And Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Remember what I told you, right? They knew dreams had meaning. And so they would call for the magi, for the wise men, for the priests. So when Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today, 2 years later, he feels like it's safe. Today, I've been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me. You imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard, which is a fancy way of saying in the prison house. Okay? One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer. The chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. All right? So now he feels like, okay, 2 years, now I can kind of broach the subject. Plus, I got a common reference point, right? So we see, of course, 2 full years. 2 years. It's not a peep, not a visit. He doesn't go by the prison house and go, hey, Joseph, how's it going, buddy? I'm living large in the king's house again. Thank you very much for the interpretation, okay? Nothing, right? Not even a Christmas card. Dear Joseph, life is good. Wish you were here. Your pal, the butler, right? Nothing. Crickets. Joseph endures 2 more years after those dreams. Those dreams set the stage. But remember what I said. God's plan marches according to God's schedule. We get impatient. Right? We want things to happen now. Right? We want to order at the speaker, drive around to the window, and have them hand us our food. Right? That's so convenient. Right? We used to, you want to go, look, I'm going to go inside, I'm going to order at the counter to go. Now, I don't want to do that. That's too inconvenient. I want to order at the speaker, just drive around to the window. Right? And then, of course, I always get it wrong. You got to get out and go in anyway and go, hey, you got my order wrong.
I despise the drive-thru.
Huh?
I despise the drive-thru.
Yeah. So 2 years. 2 years. Joseph continued in prison. He tried to get out early. Remember me. Right? No. 2 years. But this was all part of God's plan. 2 years. Joseph wasn't ready yet. Right? Joseph wasn't fully prepared. It was premature to pull Joseph out of that prison the 2 years before. He wasn't ready yet. But now, after 2 years, Joseph is ready. He is prepared intellectually, mentally, emotionally. He is ready for the job God has for him. We're going to see as we move forward in this story that God has been planning this moment for 13 years, 14 years, maybe even longer. He was planning this moment when Joseph was having the dreams back at home. God had this all laid out. He was going to use Joseph. He knew Joseph was the man that he could use for this. But he couldn't use him as a 17-year-old kid. He couldn't use him as a 23 or 25 or a 26-year-old, however he was, steward out of Potiphar's house. And he couldn't use him coming out of the prison house until he had taken the full time in that prison house to mature. But now he's ready. Now he's ready, and God sends the dreams. Pharaoh has the dream. So we see in those dreams, that dream has sevens in it. Oh, there we go. Seven cows, 7 heads of grain or ears of corn. If you're in your King James, I think it calls it ears of corn. The first set of sevens are full and healthy. The second set are scrawny and shriveled. Now the wise men or the magi are consulted, but this is no ordinary dream. Okay? So dreams are interpreted according to the religious philosophies of the culture. Right? It's a spiritual dream. They look and say, well, this is the way people think, or this is how our philosophies teach us. The dreams that God gave Pharaoh were outside of their religious structure. Most of what God does is outside of the religious structure. Fast forward, look at Jesus and his ministry. You know why the Pharisees and the Sadducees hated him? Because he preached and he taught and he lived outside of the religious structure. And he was talking about reconciling man to God, and not through the Pharisees or the Sadducees, through him. Right? So when Pharaoh has this dream and he goes to the Magi and the wise men, he's got to have 7 cows, and they go, wait, 7? What does 7 mean? Do you know what is that? No, I've consulted all of our ancient manuals. We don't do sevens. Sevens are not a thing. Cows. What about cows? Do we have any cows? Jackals. We got jackals. Jackals we got. Crocodiles. Hippopotami. Oh my, hippopotami. But cows? Cows, we don't have no cows. And so that it didn't fit in the schemes of their system, right? And these guys were afraid to guess. Because, I mean, if you popped up and said, oh, no, I know what that means. I know what that means. You're going to have 7 good kids and 7 bad kids. And the bad kids are going to eat the good kids. And then you're going to have to kill them all. All right? So we know, right? Everybody here, we know what the story means. You've already thought ahead, right? You know that it means 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine and all that. So when you got into the 7 years of famine, Pharaoh's going to be looking at you going, we're starving to death. And I ain't had no kids. You were a liar, right? And you think the baker got it bad, right? If Pharaoh may be starving to death, but the baker, I mean, these guys, they're going to make the baker look, they're going to wish they'd done to them what they did to the baker, all right? So Pharaoh doesn't take kindly to the deceivers, so that was certainly on their minds. You know, it's better to tell Pharaoh we don't know than to tell him a lie. All right? And in verse 9, we see this phrase, finally, I got tickled. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer speaks up. Right? They're having this big confab. The Magi are going back and forth. Right? Pharaoh's going, what does it mean, guys? And they're like, we don't know. And where's the cupbearer? Cupbearer's over here in the corner, you know. He's watching all this go on. And he knows. As soon as Pharaoh said, I had a dream, this has popped up in his head, okay? He's hanging around the edges of the room. He's watching his boss agonize over these dreams. And he's thinking, should I say something? It's been 2 years. Has it been long enough? And I think probably he says, watching the Magi trip all over themselves, trying not answer the question without getting sent to prison. And finally he says, hey, boss, right? You know that time you had me thrown in prison? Right? This is an awkward moment. He doesn't know how Pharaoh's going to react to this, right? He's like, does Pharaoh remember and get mad all over again because now he's frustrated because these Magi can't tell him what the dream is? But he has to speak up. And so he tells the story of Joseph, right? He said, there was this Hebrew kid, you know, he answered, he interpreted my dreams, but you notice what he left out. What did Joseph tell him? He said, tell him, mention me to Pharaoh, tell him what? Tell him I'm kidnapped. Tell him I don't deserve to be in prison, right? Defend me. Right? And what does he say? He said, you know, he doesn't tell him about that, right? He doesn't tell him Joseph's story. What does he say? Oh, there's this Hebrew kid in jail. He can interpret dreams. It all came true. I'm living proof. Right? He wasn't there to do Joseph any favors. He spoke because he could no longer remain quiet. Why could he no longer remain quiet? Because it was part of God's plan. He had to speak. God was not going to let him remain quiet. And it finally just put enough pressure on him. He said, hey, you know, I remember once, you know, I messed up. You remember when I messed up, Pharaoh? But look, it's a good thing because there's a kid who can interpret these kind of dreams, right? He saw the similarities, right? I had three grapes, or 3 clusters of grapes. The baker had 3 baskets. You got 7. Of course, you're Pharaoh. Why wouldn't you have 7, right? You would have more than me. But this kid, this Hebrew kid, he can interpret it. And so we see now the point of the story. The point of the story is God's plan has come to the moment when God is fixing to deliver Joseph. Okay? So we've seen all of this come through. So next week, yeah, I know, it's 8 o'clock. Wow. I've been on a roll. Next week, our young hero says, hey, I hear you need a good manager.